Monday, September 23rd, 1918, 4:47 in the morning, Base Hospital Number 45, American Expeditionary Forces, Toul, France. They died faster than the bullets could kill them. In the autumn of 1918, as the Great War ground toward its bloody conclusion, a new enemy swept through the trenches with a speed and ferocity that stunned commanders who had grown accustomed to industrial slaughter. Men who had survived poison gas, artillery barrages, and machine gun fire fell to an invisible killer that turned their lungs to bloody sponges within hours. By the time the Armistice was signed, this silent assassin had claimed more lives than 4 years of mechanized warfare. It killed more American soldiers than German bullets. It killed more French troops than German shells. It killed more British servicemen than all the battles of the Somme and Passchendaele combined. The influenza pandemic of 1918 did not simply accompany the First World War. It transformed it, exposing the terrible vulnerability of armies that had learned to fear steel but had forgotten to fear biology. The story of how a virus defeated the greatest military powers on Earth begins not with a cough in a crowded trench, but with a single moment of ordinary routine that would cascade into extraordinary catastrophe. The morning of March 11, 1918, dawned cold and clear over Camp Funston, Kansas. At precisely 6:15, Private Albert Gitchell reported to the camp hospital with a complaint so mundane it barely warranted attention. He had a headache. His throat hurt. He felt feverish and weak. The company cook, recently arrived from Haskell County, where a strange respiratory illness had been making the rounds, assumed he had caught a common cold. The ward surgeon, Captain Edward M. Wood, examined him briefly, noted his elevated temperature of 104 degrees, and sent him to a bed in the infirmary. By noon that same day, over 100 soldiers had reported similar symptoms. Within a week, more than 500 men at Camp Funston were hospitalized with what doctors initially dismissed as ordinary seasonal influenza. They had no idea they were witnessing the birth of the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history. Camp Funston was an immense sprawl of hastily constructed barracks housing 56,000 American soldiers preparing for deployment to the Western Front. The camp was a model of military efficiency, a factory designed to transform civilians into soldiers at industrial scale. Men slept in rows so tightly packed that their cots nearly touched. They ate in mess halls that seated thousands. They drilled in massive formations, shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same air, sharing the same spaces, creating the perfect conditions for respiratory disease to spread like fire through dry timber. The camp's chief surgeon, a competent but overworked medical officer named Lieutenant Colonel F.W. Weed, had dealt with respiratory outbreaks before. Every winter brought its share of colds and flu. This seemed no different, but it was different. Profoundly, horrifyingly different. The disease that emerged from Camp Funston in March of 1918 was not the familiar seasonal influenza that killed the very young and very old while leaving healthy adults relatively unscathed. This was something new, something that medical science had never encountered. It attacked with particular savagery the very demographic that should have been most resistant, young men in the prime of life, aged 20 to 40, with robust immune systems and strong constitutions. When it killed with shocking speed. Men who seemed healthy at breakfast could be dead by dinner. The virus triggered what doctors would later identify as a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system that turned the body's defenses against itself. The healthier the victim's immune system, the more violent the response. Their lungs filled with fluid. They drowned in their own bodily secretions. Their faces turned blue from lack of oxygen, a condition called cyanosis that gave them the appearance of having been gassed. Some bled from their noses and ears. Others coughed up blood in such quantities that the ward floors became slippery with it. And yet, despite these alarming symptoms, the outbreak at Camp Funston was treated as a local concern, a temporary setback that would pass like any seasonal illness. From Kansas, the disease moved with the troops. In March and April of 1918, the United States was mobilizing men at an unprecedented rate, sending 200,000 soldiers per month across the Atlantic to join the Allied forces in France. These men traveled in ships so crowded that thousands of bodies were packed into holds designed for far fewer passengers. They breathed recycled air. They slept in bunks, stacked 3 and 4 high. They shared latrines and mess facilities. The troopship conditions were ideal for spreading respiratory illness, and the new influenza moved invisibly among them, carried in respiratory droplets, passed from man to man with each cough and sneeze and shouted command. By the time these ships reached Europe, the disease had already established beachheads in camps across Britain and France. Still, military doctors remained largely unconcerned. Reports from Camp Funston mentioned a spike in respiratory cases, but battlefield casualties were so horrific that a few hundred men with the flu barely registered. In April of 1918 alone, over 80,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded in action. Against such staggering numbers, what were a few hundred cases of influenza? The war demanded bodies, and the bodies kept coming, infected or not. The first wave of the pandemic, which rolled through military camps and ports from March through May of 1918, was relatively mild by the standards of what was to come. It was described by contemporary observers as 3-day fever or Spanish influenza, though it had nothing to do with Spain. The name stuck because Spain, as a neutral country, had no wartime censorship, and Spanish newspapers freely reported on the illness sweeping through Madrid, including the fact that King Alfonso XIII had fallen ill. In the combatant nations, censors suppressed news of widespread illness in the ranks, fearing it would harm morale or give intelligence to the enemy. The public heard almost nothing about influenza in the spring of 1918. The soldiers knew, of course. They lived with it. But soldiers were expected to endure hardship, and this particular hardship seemed temporary. In the trenches of the Western Front, where men had learned to live with lice, trench foot, shell shock, and the constant presence of death, a bout of flu seemed almost trivial. Captain Louis Barthas, a French soldier who kept a detailed diary of his war service, noted in April that many men in his unit had fallen ill with a nasty grip that left them weak and feverish for several days. "But this is war," he wrote, "and we are expected to bear such inconveniences without complaint." The German army experienced similar outbreaks. General Erich Ludendorff, planning his great spring offensive of 1918, watched with mounting frustration as thousands of his soldiers fell sick. The illness disrupted training schedules and reduced combat effectiveness at a critical moment, but Ludendorff, like his Allied counterparts, assumed the outbreak would burn itself out quickly. He pressed forward with his attacks regardless. The spring offensive, Germany's final desperate attempt to break the Allied lines before American reinforcements could tip the balance, began on March 21, 1918, with a massive artillery bombardment followed by stormtrooper assaults that initially achieved stunning gains. But by June the offensive had stalled, and one factor in its failure was the physical condition of German troops. Thousands of soldiers were too sick to fight effectively. They advanced across the battlefield in weakened condition, vulnerable not only to enemy fire but to the viral infection that sapped their strength. An estimated 500,000 German soldiers contracted influenza during the spring wave. It was not yet killing in significant numbers, but it was degrading combat capability at the worst possible time. On the Allied side, the build-up of American forces continued despite the disease. By July of 1918, over 1 million American soldiers had reached France, transforming the strategic balance, but they brought the virus with them, and conditions in the trenches ensured its continued spread. Soldiers lived underground in cramped dugouts carved into the wet earth. They shared blankets and eating utensils. They huddled together against the cold. Sanitation was primitive at best. The trenches were breeding grounds for disease, and influenza found an ideal environment. Medical officers treating the sick noticed something odd. The illness seemed to disappear during the hot summer months, as flu typically does, only to return with renewed violence in the late summer and early autumn. What they did not know, could not know, was that the virus was mutating. It was becoming more lethal. The relatively mild spring wave had been merely a prelude. The second wave, which began in August of 1918, would be apocalyptic. On August 22, 1918, a British ship, the HMS China, departed from Sierra Leone carrying troops back to England after a deployment in West Africa. Within days of departure, 2 men fell ill with influenza. By the time the ship reached port, over 600 of the roughly 1,000 men aboard were sick. 75 would die. The disease that emerged in late August was fundamentally different from the spring strain. It killed with terrifying efficiency. Its victims experienced rapid onset of symptoms: crushing headache, high fever, severe body aches, and within hours, complications that turned deadly. The virus attacked the respiratory system with unprecedented aggression. Patients developed severe pneumonia. Their lungs became so congested with fluid and infected tissue that breathing became agonizing, then impossible. Those who survived described feeling like they were drowning on dry land. From Europe, the mutated virus spread in all directions simultaneously. It appeared in Boston in late August, in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and in Brest, France, almost at the same time, suggesting multiple simultaneous introductions. Within weeks, it had reached every continent. In military camps across the United States, the disease exploded with shocking velocity. Camp Devens, near Boston, was hit particularly hard. By mid-September, over 14,000 soldiers at Devens had contracted influenza. Hundreds died within days of first symptoms. The camp hospital, designed to handle a few hundred patients, was overwhelmed by thousands. Men died in their bunks, waiting for medical attention that never came. The morgue overflowed. Bodies were stacked like cordwood because there was no place else to put them. A young physician named Roy Grist, stationed at Camp Devens, wrote a letter to a colleague that captured the horror with clinical precision. These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of influenza, and when brought to the hospital they very rapidly develop the most severe type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face, until it is hard to distinguish the coloured men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. By late September of 1918, the pandemic was killing more Americans each day than combat operations in France. The virus did not discriminate by rank or status. It struck generals and privates with equal fury. It killed nurses and doctors who treated the sick. Camp hospitals became death traps. Medical staff, exhausted from working around the clock with inadequate resources, fell ill themselves and died alongside their patients. The mortality rate in some camps approached 10% of all personnel. Entire units were rendered combat ineffective, not by enemy action, but by disease. Training schedules collapsed. Deployments to Europe were delayed or cancelled because the men were too sick to travel. On the Western Front, where millions of soldiers lived in conditions that were medieval in their squalor and modern in their deadliness, the second wave of influenza struck with apocalyptic force. In September and October of 1918, as the Allied armies were pushing the Germans back in what would become the final offensive of the war, soldiers were falling by the thousands to an enemy they could not see. The British Expeditionary Force reported over 31,000 influenza cases in October alone. The French army counted hundreds of thousands of sick. The German army, already reeling from military defeats and collapsing morale, was devastated. Ludendorff would later write that the influenza epidemic robbed us of our last chance of victory. German soldiers, weakened by years of poor nutrition due to the Allied blockade, were particularly vulnerable. The virus killed them by the tens of thousands. In the trenches, the distinction between combat casualties and disease casualties began to blur. Men who died of influenza were often listed as having died of pneumonia, which was technically accurate but obscured the true cause. Medical officers, operating under wartime censorship, were forbidden from reporting detailed information about the epidemic for fear of harming morale. The public at home read sanitized accounts of grippe affecting the troops, with little hint of the scale of the catastrophe. Soldiers wrote home describing comrades who had been perfectly healthy one day and dead the next, but military censors often redacted such details. The result was a strange cognitive dissonance. Everyone involved in the war knew influenza was ravaging the armies, but official reports minimized the crisis. In October of 1918, the pandemic reached its peak. It was killing an estimated 10,000 Americans per week. Military camps became charnel houses. Hospitals ran out of beds, so the sick were placed on floors and in hallways. They ran out of coffins, so bodies were wrapped in sheets and buried in mass graves. Medical supplies were exhausted. There were not enough doctors, not enough nurses, not enough orderlies, not enough of anything. The few medical professionals still on their feet worked until they collapsed from exhaustion or contracted the disease themselves. Entire medical units were wiped out. The statistics from this period are almost incomprehensible in their scale. Camp Pike, Arkansas, reported 8,000 cases and nearly 700 deaths in October. Camp Custer, Michigan, had 10,000 cases. Camp Grant, Illinois, had over 11,000. Fort Riley, Kansas, where some historians believe the pandemic may have originated, was overwhelmed. These were not small outposts. These were enormous military installations, each housing tens of thousands of troops, and influenza was cutting through them like a scythe through wheat. The human cost was measured not just in deaths but in suffering. Witnesses described scenes that seemed to belong to the Middle Ages, not the modern era. Hospital wards filled with men coughing up blood, gasping for air, their faces turning blue, their bodies racked with fever and pain. Nurses, themselves often sick, moved from bed to bed, offering what little comfort they could, knowing that most of their patients would not survive. Doctors, trained to heal, watched helplessly as young men died despite every effort to save them. There was no effective treatment. Physicians tried everything: aspirin in massive doses, vaccines against secondary bacterial infections, steam inhalations, bloodletting in some desperate cases. Nothing worked. The virus was merciless. Private John Acker, a 19-year-old soldier from Pennsylvania stationed at Camp Dix, New Jersey, wrote to his mother in early October describing the situation. "Mother, you cannot imagine what it is like here. Men are dying all around us. I have seen things I cannot describe. Yesterday, a fellow in the bunk next to mine was laughing and joking at breakfast. By evening he could not breathe, and by midnight he was dead. The doctors do not know how to stop it. We are all terrified." Private Acker's letter was found among his effects after he died of influenza on October 7, 1918, less than a week after writing it. The pandemic affected military operations directly. Units scheduled for combat were too depleted by disease to fight effectively. Replacements trained to fill the ranks of casualties could not be sent forward because they were sick. The American Expeditionary Forces, commanded by General John Pershing, suffered over 70,000 influenza cases in the final months of the war. More than 8,000 American soldiers died of the disease in September and October, a figure that rivals the combat deaths during the same period. Pershing, a commander known for his iron discipline and determination, was forced to confront a tactical problem he could not solve with firepower. His army was being destroyed by an invisible enemy. General Pershing himself wrote in his memoirs about the devastating impact of the epidemic. The influenza pandemic reached the height of its virulence during the fall of 1918 and added greatly to the burden of an army engaged in active operations. It seriously depleted the fighting strength of our troops, and the hardships endured by the sick in the field were very severe. This understated language, typical of military reporting, concealed a crisis of staggering proportions. Entire divisions were combat ineffective. Field hospitals established to handle battlefield wounds were overrun by disease victims. Medical personnel were so overwhelmed that triage became brutal. Only those with some chance of survival received treatment. The rest were left to die. In the German army, the situation was even worse. German soldiers, already exhausted from 4 years of continuous warfare and half-starved from the Allied blockade, had little resistance to the virus. The epidemic spread through German trenches with devastating speed. Entire regiments were incapacitated. The German medical system, crippled by shortages of everything from bandages to morphine, could offer almost nothing to flu victims. German soldiers died by the thousands in field hospitals that lacked basic supplies. Some historians argue that the influenza epidemic was a decisive factor in Germany's collapse in the fall of 1918. The German army, which had survived 4 years of industrialized slaughter, finally broke not just from military pressure but from disease, starvation, and exhaustion working in combination. On November 11th, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns fell silent. The armistice took effect, and the Great War ended. Soldiers on both sides climbed out of their trenches, cautiously at first, then with growing jubilation. Men who had tried to kill each other hours before met in no man's land to shake hands and exchange cigarettes. The war was over. They had survived, or so they thought. But the virus did not recognize the armistice. It continued to kill with undiminished fury. In the weeks following the end of combat, thousands of soldiers who had survived 4 years of war died of influenza. They had endured Verdun and the Somme, Ypres and Passchendaele, the great spring offensives and the final Allied advance. They had survived gas attacks and artillery barrages, machine gun fire and trench raids, and then they died of the flu. The full accounting of the dead took years to compile, and even now, more than a century later, the exact numbers remain uncertain. What is known with confidence is that the influenza pandemic of 1918 killed more people in a shorter time than any other disease outbreak in history. Worldwide, the death toll has been estimated at between 50 million and 100 million people, though recent scholarship suggests the true number may have been even higher. For comparison, the Great War itself killed approximately 20 million people over 4 years. The flu killed at least twice that many in less than 2 years, and possibly 5 times as many. It was the deadliest pandemic since the Black Death of the 14th century. Among military personnel, the numbers were staggering. In the United States, military alone, over 675,000 soldiers contracted influenza. Of these, over 57,000 died, a mortality rate of nearly 9% among those infected. To put this in perspective, over 57,000 American soldiers died of the flu during the pandemic, while approximately 53,000 died in combat during the entire First World War. The disease killed more American military personnel than German bullets, shells, gas, and bayonets combined. The same pattern held for other combatant nations. The British military lost over 200,000 men to the pandemic. The French lost hundreds of thousands. The Germans may have lost as many as 400,000 soldiers to the disease, though exact figures are difficult to determine given the chaos of Germany's collapse in late 1918. But the military deaths, horrific as they were, represented only a fraction of the total toll. The virus spread from military camps to the civilian population with devastating effect. In the United States, over 675,000 civilians died between September 1918 and April 1919, more than the total combat deaths of all American wars in the 20th century combined. Entire families were wiped out. Schools closed. Businesses shut down. Morgues overflowed. Cities ran out of coffins and gravediggers. In Philadelphia, where a massive war bonds parade in September had created perfect conditions for viral spread, over 12,000 people died in a matter of weeks. Bodies piled up in homes because the undertakers could not keep pace with the dead. In Boston, over 5,000 died. In New York, over 30,000. The numbers were similar in cities across the nation. Globally, the impact was apocalyptic in certain regions. India may have lost as many as 20 million people, perhaps more. Entire villages in remote areas were depopulated. In Western Samoa, brought into the war on the Allied side and therefore connected to military shipping lanes, the virus killed 22% of the entire population in a matter of weeks. In Alaska, entire Inuit communities were annihilated. In South Africa, in Persia, in China, the death tolls climbed into the millions. The pandemic killed more people in a single year than the bubonic plague killed in a century. It killed more people in 24 weeks than AIDS killed in 24 years. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers who had survived years of trench warfare returned home to find their families dead or dying. Communities that had sent men off to war with parades and patriotic fervor welcomed home the survivors with funerals and mass graves. The jubilation of Armistice Day was tempered by the grim reality that the dying continued. Victory celebrations were muted by the knowledge that the enemy soldiers had not been the only threat, and perhaps not even the primary threat. In many communities, more families lost members to the flu than to combat. The war memorials that sprang up in towns and cities across the Allied nations listed names of the fallen, but many of those names represented men who had died not on the battlefield but in camp hospitals, killed by a virus. The military response to the pandemic, or more accurately the lack of an effective response, became a source of bitter controversy in the years following the war. Military planners had prepared for every conceivable battlefield contingency. They had developed tactics for trench warfare, strategies for deploying artillery, protocols for handling gas attacks. But they had no plan for a pandemic. Medical officers were overwhelmed. Public health measures that might have slowed the spread, such as quarantines, social distancing, and mask wearing, were largely ignored in military contexts because they interfered with training and deployment schedules. The needs of the war effort took precedence over public health. Troopships continued to sail packed with men despite the known presence of influenza. Training camps remained open and crowded despite epidemic conditions. Soldiers were not quarantined even when obviously sick because manpower was desperately needed at the front. In retrospect, many of these decisions appear to have been catastrophically wrong, but they made sense within the logic of total war. Commanders were fighting what they believed was the most important conflict in human history. Every other consideration, including public health, was secondary to defeating the enemy. The irony, visible only in hindsight, is that the decision to prioritize military operations over epidemic control may have prolonged the war and increased casualties. German forces in the fall of 1918 were not just defeated by Allied military pressure. They were weakened by starvation, exhaustion, and disease, to the point where effective resistance became impossible. Had the Allies been less affected by the pandemic, the war might have ended sooner. Had the Germans been less affected, they might have prolonged the conflict. The virus was not a neutral force. It was a combatant in its own right, and it shaped the outcome of battles. The medical lessons of the pandemic were profound but slow to be absorbed. The 1918 flu exposed the inadequacy of contemporary medical science in the face of a novel pathogen. Doctors in 1918 did not know that influenza was caused by a virus. The influenza virus would not be isolated until 1933. They did not understand how it spread, how it mutated, or why it killed young healthy adults. They had no effective treatments and no vaccines. Everything they tried was essentially guesswork. Some treatments, such as massive doses of aspirin, may have done more harm than good. The pandemic demonstrated that modern armies, for all their technological sophistication, were still vulnerable to ancient enemies. Generals could command tanks and aircraft and poison gas, but they were helpless against a microscopic organism that could not be seen, could not be targeted, and could not be defeated with firepower. In the decades following the war, military planners began to take biological threats more seriously. Public health infrastructure was strengthened. Research into infectious diseases received increased funding. The terrible lessons of 1918 informed the development of influenza vaccines and antiviral medications. During the Second World War, military medical services were far better prepared to handle epidemic disease, though the threat of pandemic influenza remained a constant concern. The fear that a repeat of 1918 might decimate the armies of the world shaped military medical policy for generations, but for the men who lived through it, both the war and the pandemic, the experience left scars that never fully healed. Survivors spoke of a double trauma, the horror of combat and the horror of watching comrades die not from wounds but from disease. Many felt a sense of betrayal. They had expected to die gloriously in battle if they died at all. Dying of the flu seemed meaningless, unheroic, a cruel joke played by fate. There was no dignity in drowning in your own fluids, no valor in coughing up blood until death came as a mercy. The flu dead were buried alongside the combat dead, but they did not receive the same honors, the same recognition. Their names appeared on memorials, but without the same reverence accorded to those who fell to enemy fire. 60 years after the Armistice, an elderly man named William Sardo sat in a small apartment in Philadelphia, speaking to a historian who was collecting oral histories of the Great War. Sardo had enlisted in 1917 at age 18, trained at Camp Devens, and shipped out to France in October of 1918, arriving just weeks before the war ended. He never fired a shot in combat, but he saw more death than many combat veterans. The flu was worse than any battle could have been, Sardo said, his voice steady but his eyes distant. At Camp Devens, before we shipped out, men were dying so fast they could not bury them. They stacked the coffins outside the chapel like firewood. You would see a fellow at breakfast, and by dinner his bunk was empty, not wounded, not sent home. Dead. Just dead. When we got to France, it was the same thing. The hospitals were full of flu cases. I remember walking past a field hospital and hearing the sounds. Men coughing, choking, crying out for water, for their mothers, for God. We were told to stay away, but you could not avoid it. The virus was everywhere. It travelled with us. It was in the ships, in the camps, in the trenches. You could not fight it. You could not see it coming. You just hoped it passed you by. Sardo paused, his hands folded in his lap. People talk about the war. They talk about the battles, the heroes, the bravery. And that is right. That happened. But they do not talk about the flu. They do not remember how many died not from German shells, but from being packed together like animals, breathing the same bad air, spreading sickness to one another. The generals talked about sacrifice for the greater good. Well, we sacrificed, but I am not sure anyone learned the lesson. The lesson, if there was one, remained contested for decades. The 1918 pandemic was studied extensively by epidemiologists and historians, but its place in popular memory remained marginal compared to the war itself. The flu dead were overshadowed by the war dead. The pandemic was treated as a footnote to the Great War rather than as a parallel catastrophe of equal or greater magnitude. This historical amnesia persisted until the 21st century, when new pandemics, particularly SARS, H1N1, and later COVID-19, forced a re-examination of 1918, scholars began to ask why the lessons of the deadliest pandemic in history had been so thoroughly forgotten. The answer lay partly in the nature of disease itself. It lacked the dramatic narrative structure of war. There were no heroic charges, no decisive battles, no clear villains or heroes. Just millions of people dying quietly, anonymously, in hospitals and homes around the world. But among those who served in the military during 1918, among those who witnessed the devastation firsthand, there was no forgetting. They carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Dr. Roy Grist, who had written so vividly about the horrors at Camp Devens, never spoke publicly about his experiences until late in life. When he did, his voice cracked with emotion. "I have seen many terrible things in my career," he said in an interview in the 1960s. "But nothing compared to that autumn. Nothing. We were supposed to be healers. We could do nothing but watch them die. Young men, healthy men, strong men, dying like flies. And we were helpless. Completely helpless." General John Pershing, in his memoirs published after the war, devoted surprisingly little space to the pandemic, perhaps because it was a battle he had lost. But in his private correspondence, Pershing admitted that the epidemic had been one of the greatest challenges of his command. "We lost more men to disease than to the enemy in the final months," he wrote to a fellow officer in 1923. "History will remember our victories. It should also remember what we lost to an enemy we could not see and could not defeat." The cemeteries of the First World War, those vast fields of white crosses that stretch across France and Belgium, contain thousands of men who died not in combat but of disease. Their graves bear the same markers as those who fell in battle, and most visitors do not know the difference. But if you look closely at the dates of death, a pattern emerges. In October and November of 1918, after the major battles had ended but before the armistice was signed, there is a spike in deaths. Many of these men died of influenza. They lie now in neat rows, their names recorded, their sacrifice honored, but the specific nature of their death often forgotten. In the military hospitals of the Great War, in the trenches where men fought and died, in the troopships that carried soldiers across the Atlantic, and in the training camps where young men learned to be soldiers, the influenza pandemic of 1918 killed with a cold efficiency that rivaled any weapon of modern warfare. It killed more Americans in uniform than German machine guns. It killed more soldiers worldwide than artillery. It was the unseen enemy, the silent killer, the ghost in the trenches. And it won. The final reckoning of the 1918 influenza pandemic forces a reassessment of the Great War itself. The conflict that shaped the 20th century, that destroyed empires and redrew maps, that introduced the world to mechanized slaughter and total war, was also the conflict that enabled the deadliest disease outbreak in human history. The armies of the world, in their determination to concentrate millions of men in confined spaces, to transport them rapidly across oceans and continents, to pack them into trenches and barracks and ships, created the perfect conditions for a pandemic. They built a global distribution system for a virus, and when that virus emerged, it exploited the infrastructure of war with devastating effectiveness. The men who died of influenza in 1918 were casualties of war, just as surely as those who died from bullets and shells. They died because military necessity trumped public health, because victory demanded sacrifice, because the logic of total war allowed no room for precaution. They died in service to their countries, and they deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to the war but as central figures in the great tragedy of 1918. The Spanish flu did not accompany the First World War. It was part of the war, inseparable from it, enabled by it, amplified by it. And in the end, it killed more soldiers than all the armies of the world combined. In the century since, the world has fought many wars and endured many pandemics. but never has it faced both simultaneously on such a scale. The lesson of 1918, hard-learned and too quickly forgotten, is that war and disease are not separate catastrophes but interconnected threats that amplify one another. The generals who planned the battles of the Great War could not have known this. They had no way to predict that the mobilization of millions would create the conditions for pandemic spread. But we know now. We have seen what happens when the machinery of war meets the biology of contagion. The dead of 1918, military and civilian alike, stand as silent witnesses to a truth that every generation must learn anew, that the greatest threats to human life are not always the ones we prepare for, and that sometimes the deadliest enemy is the one we cannot see until it is far too late. The autumn of 1918 was a season of death unlike any other in human history. In the trenches of France, on the hospital ships crossing the Atlantic, in the training camps of America and the field hospitals of Europe, men died not with rifles in their hands but with lungs full of fluid, drowning on dry land, victims of an enemy that could not be fought with courage or skill or firepower. They died despite the best efforts of doctors and nurses. They died despite the prayers of chaplains and the tears of comrades. They died because the world had learned to make war on an industrial scale, but had not learned to fight disease on the same scale. And when the guns finally fell silent, when the armistice brought an end to the killing on the battlefield, the virus kept killing. It did not recognize armistices. It did not sign treaties. It simply killed until it burned itself out, leaving behind a world forever changed, a generation decimated, and a lesson written in 50 million graves.